There are monsters born from circumstance, and monsters born from choice. Alucard was both. For centuries he had walked the earth as its most perfect predator, a thing that had chosen damnation not out of weakness, but out of a hunger for meaning in a meaningless eternity. He had been Dracula once, a king who refused mortality. Then he became a weapon, bound by seals and servitude to an organization that hunted the very darkness he embodied. And he laughed at the irony. He laughed because slavery was the only relationship that amused him anymore. Without chains there was no rebellion. Without masters there was no defiance. And without defiance, immortality was just waiting. But even waiting grows tiresome. The night it happened, Alucard stood in the ruins of what had been a cathedral, though calling it sacred would have been generous. The cultists who had gathered there believed they were summoning something older than God. They were half right. They had carved sigils into the stone that predated Latin, predated Rome, predated the languages that gave birth to the concept of sin. They had mixed alchemy with technology, forbidden relics with experimental machinery, and the result was a tear not in flesh, but in reality itself. The kind of wound that universes bleed through. Alucard had come to kill them naturally. That was his function, his purpose, his entertainment. But as he stepped through the blood and the chanting, as his shadows consumed the cultists one by one, he felt something he had not felt in a very, very long time. Curiosity. The machinery hummed with a frequency that did not belong to Earth. The sigils pulsed with a light that was not light at all, but the absence of something fundamental. And when the final cultist died, gurgling his last prayer to gods that did not care, the tear widened. It was not an explosion. It was an inversion. Reality folded inward, collapsing on itself like a lung that had forgotten how to breathe. Alucard did not resist. Resistance implied fear, and he had not known fear since the day he chose to become what he was. He let the void take him. He let it pull him through dimensions that had no names, through colors that had no place in human perception, through a space that was not space at all but something far colder, far older, far more hostile than the hell he had been promised. And then he was falling, not through air, not through darkness, through something that screamed without sound, that writhed without form, that hated without reason. The warp did not welcome him. It did not reject him either. It simply was, and Alucard was simply there, suspended in a maelstrom of raw emotion and impossible geometry. For the first time in centuries, he felt the edges of his existence tested. His body, which had reformed from ash and blood and shadow 1,000 times, struggled to maintain coherence. His mind, which had housed countless souls and lifetimes, felt the pressure of something vast and hungry pressing against the walls of his consciousness. He laughed. It started as a chuckle, low and dark, echoing through the immaterial storm. Then it grew, louder, wilder. The laughter of a man-no, a monster who had finally found something new. Something unexpected. Something that did not simply die when he willed it. The warp roared around him, and he roared back, his voice a challenge to the abyss itself. But the laughter faded, not because he was afraid, not because he was defeated, but because as he tumbled through the endless chaos, as shapes that might have been demons or might have been nightmares, or might have been both began to circle him like sharks scenting blood, Alucard realized something profoundly unsettling. This place was not hell. Hell was a punishment for the wicked, a consequence for the damned. Hell had rules. Hell had structure. Hell had meaning. This place had none of that. It was not a prison. It was not a realm. It was a wound in existence itself, a place where thought became flesh and emotion became law, where gods were born from belief, and reality was a consensus that could be rewritten by sheer will. And as Alucard floated there, suspended in the space between madness and annihilation, he understood that he had not been pulled into another world. He had been pulled into a war that had no end, fought by forces that could not die, in a universe that had weaponized suffering into an art form. For the first time in his endless existence, Alucard felt something that might have been respect. Or perhaps it was recognition. He had spent centuries as the ultimate predator, the apex of monstrosity, the thing that other monsters feared. But this place, this impossible, beautiful, hideous place was a predator that made him look like prey. And that thought made him smile. Not the mocking grin he wore when slaughtering enemies. Not the cold smirk he reserved for those foolish enough to think they could command him. This was something else. Something genuine. The smile of a creature who had finally, after an eternity of boredom, found something worth his attention. The warp twisted around him, and Alucard let it. Let it probe. Let it test. Let it try to understand what he was. Because he was curious, too. Curious about this place that felt like chaos and order screaming at each other in a language only madness could translate. Curious about the shape circling him, eyes that were not eyes watching from angles that geometry had no name for. Curious about what it meant to be immortal in a place where death was negotiable and reality was a lie that everyone agreed to tell. He had been a monster who chose his chains, a king who became a slave, a weapon that defined its own purpose. But here, in this place between places, those definitions meant nothing. Here, he was not bound by seals or masters or even the concept of obedience. Here, he was simply Alucard, and that was enough. They came in waves, as they always did. Not with strategy, but with inevitability. Demons poured from the shifting folds of the warp like water finding cracks in a dam, drawn by the scent of something that did not belong. Alucard hung suspended in the immaterial void, and they descended upon him with claws that could tear souls from flesh, with mouths that spoke languages that unraveled sanity, with forms that violated every law of nature and several that nature had never bothered to write down. He killed the first 100 effortlessly. His shadows expanded like wings, swallowing the nearest demon whole before it could even scream. His guns materialized in his hands, casual and jackal. Relics from a world that felt impossibly distant now, and the blessed silver rounds tore through warp flesh with satisfying precision. Blood that was not quite blood sprayed across the non-space, and demons shrieked as they dissolved back into the raw stuff of chaos. Alucard laughed, spinning through the swarm with the grace of a dancer and the lethality of a guillotine. But then they came back. Not different demons. The same ones. Reformed. Reconstituted. The thing he had just destroyed with a headshot was crawling back into existence 10 meters away, its form knitting together from pure spite and stolen emotion. The demon he had bisected was whole again, circling him with eyes that burned with something that might have been fury or might have been amusement. Alucard's laughter slowed. This was new. He had fought immortals before. Vampires who regenerated. Ghouls who refused to die. Humans who had made pacts with devils for the gift of resurrection. But they all had limits. Destroy the heart, sever the head, burn the body to ash. There was always a method, always a threshold beyond which even the unkillable became very, very killable. These things had no such threshold. He destroyed another demon, then another, then a dozen more. They dissolved, screamed, and returned. Again. And again. And again. It was not a battle. It was a tide. An endless, inexhaustible tide that did not care about loss because loss was temporary. Because in the warp, existence itself was negotiable. For the first time in centuries, Alucard fought something that matched his own endurance. And it thrilled him. He shifted tactics. Stopped using bullets. Stopped using shadows. Instead, he reached into the core of what he was, a vampire, a devourer, a thing that fed on life itself and began to consume. His jaws, elongated and monstrous, tore into demon flesh, ripping away chunks of their essence and pulling it into himself. He did not eat to sustain. He ate to erase. To pull them into the same void where he stored the countless souls he had consumed over the centuries. The demons paused. Not in fear. They did not know fear the way mortals did. But something in them recognized what he was doing. He was not destroying them. He was absorbing them, taking them into himself, making them part of the endless army of the damned that he carried within his own existence. And that gave them pause. Because even in the warp, where demons were born and reborn in infinite cycles, the concept of being erased, not killed, but consumed, integrated, made into something other than what they were, was unsettling. Alucard grinned, blood dripping from his fangs. And then he felt them. Not the demons. Not the swarm of lesser entities clawing at him. Something else. Something vast. Presences so immense that calling them gods felt insufficient. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply observed, their attention settling on him like the weight of dying stars. Khorne, the blood god, watched with interest. Here was violence without end, slaughter without mercy, a creature that killed not for survival or duty but for the sheer joy of it. And yet, this creature did not worship battle. It mocked it. Khorne did not know whether to be offended or entertained. Slaanesh, the prince of excess, tilted a gaze that was equal parts fascination and hunger. Here was a being that had tasted every depravity, every extreme, and found them all wanting. A hedonist who had transcended pleasure into boredom. Slaanesh whispered promises into the warp, offering sensations beyond imagination. Alucard ignored them. Scene J, the architect of fate, saw pattern. Calculations. Possibility. This creature was not bound by destiny. It existed outside the threads of fate, a variable that could not be predicted. That should have been impossible. Sench's infinite mind turned the problem over and over, searching for the angle, the scheme, the way to bend this anomaly into something useful. And Nurgle, Grandfather Nurgle, simply waited. Decay was patient. Entropy was inevitable. Even immortals rot, given enough time. This creature would learn. Eventually, Alucard felt their scrutiny, and for a moment, just a moment, he understood where he was. Not in hell. Not in some pocket dimension or alternate reality. He was in the engine room of a universe that ran on suffering. A place where gods were real because belief made them real, where emotion had mass and thought had teeth. He had stepped into a cosmic war between forces that had been killing each other since before his world had even learned to name its first deity. And they were curious about him, not afraid, not hostile, curious. Because he was something they had not encountered before. He was not born of the warp. He was not psychic. He was not bound to their laws. He fed on souls, yes, but not through ritual or faith. He devoured them, stored them, made them his. And the warp, which fed endlessly on the emotions and souls of mortals, recognized him as something adjacent. A rival predator in an ecosystem that had never needed to account for competition. Alucard stopped fighting. The demons still circled, but they did not attack. Not yet. They waited, as their gods waited, to see what this strange, undying thing would do. He floated there, blood-soaked and grinning, and looked up, if up even existed here, toward the vast intelligences watching him. And he spoke, not in words, not in thought, but in intent, raw and undeniable. Show me what else you have. The world was called Tertius Kine, and it was dying. Not from age. Not from war. Well, not entirely from war, though war was certainly helping. Tertius Kine was a hive world, one of millions scattered across the Imperium like tumors on the body of a civilization too vast to govern and too stubborn to collapse. Its population numbered in the billions, packed into towering spires of rusted metal and recycled air, where the only difference between the living and the dead was that the living still paid taxes. It was, in other words, typical. What was not typical was the rift that had torn open above the central hive, vomiting crimson light and howling winds that smelled of blood and ash. The planetary governor had declared it a meteorological anomaly. The ecclesiarchy had declared it divine judgment. The local Astra Militarum regiment had declared it a tactical problem and opened fire. None of them were correct. Chaos cultists poured through the streets like a disease-made flesh, chanting prayers to gods that listened with malicious glee. They wore the marks of the ruinous powers on their skin, their sanity long since bartered away for promises of power and immortality. They tore through the lower hives with knives and autoguns, butchering anyone who still clung to the Emperor's name. The guardsmen fought back. Of course they did. They were soldiers of the Imperium, bred on propaganda and faith, trained to hold the line even when the line was a pile of corpses and burning rubble. They dug in. They fired. They died. And then they died again, because in the Imperium of man, death was not an excuse to stop serving. Into this chaos stepped something worse. The rift shimmered, and a figure emerged. Not from the tier itself, but from the shadow. It cast a distinction that mattered only to those who understood that shadows in the warp were not reflections but doorways. He was tall, impossibly tall, dressed in red so dark it looked like dried blood. His hat cast a shadow over eyes that glowed with a light that had nothing to do with hope or mercy. His grin was wide and white and wrong. Alucard had arrived. He did not announce himself, did not proclaim his purpose or demand surrender. He simply walked into the war zone, hands in his pockets, head tilted as if listening to music only he could hear. A cultist saw him first, screamed something about an angel of the dark gods, and charged with a knife made from a human femur. Alucard caught the man's wrist mid-swing, looked at the bone knife with mild curiosity, then ripped the cultist's arm off. The cultist stared at the stump, blood fountaining, brain struggling to process what had just happened. Alucard examined the severed limb, shrugged, and tossed it aside. Then he bit the cultist's throat out. Not with fangs, with teeth, human teeth, because it was messier that way. The cultists froze. The guardsmen froze. Even the rift seemed to pause, as if the warp itself was trying to decide what it had just witnessed. Alucard swallowed, wiped his mouth, and laughed. Then he moved. Not ran, not charred. Moved. Like a shadow given permission to exist in 3 dimensions. One moment he was standing over the cultist's corpse. The next, he was 15 meters away, hand buried in another cultist's chest, pulling out a heart that was still beating. He crushed it, let the blood drip, then turned toward a cluster of guardsmen who had their lasguns trained on him. They fired. Dozens of lasbolts struck him, burning through coat and flesh, punching holes through his torso, his skull, his limbs. Alucard stood there, taking the hits, body jerking with each impact like a puppet on broken strings. The guardsmen kept firing, disciplined and desperate, because that was all they knew how to do. Then the holes closed. Flesh knitted back together. Bone reformed. Organs that had been vaporized regrew from nothing. Alucard straightened his hat, which had somehow stayed on his head despite half his skull being blown open a moment before, and smiled at them. "Good effort," he said, voice carrying over the chaos with unnatural clarity. Then he killed them too. Not all of them, just enough. 3 guardsmen torn apart in as many seconds, their bodies decorating the walls in abstract patterns. The rest scattered, instincts overriding training, because there was no protocol for this. No doctrine, no prayer that covered fighting something that regenerated from lost fire and smiled while doing it. The cultists tried to rally, thinking this monster was their salvation. Alucard disabused them of that notion by tearing through their ranks with the same indifference he had shown the guardsmen. Chaos worshippers died screaming prayers to gods who found their deaths amusing but irrelevant. Alucard did not care about their faith, did not care about their allegiance. He killed them because they were there, and because the killing was entertaining. Civilians huddled in the ruins, watching this nightmare unfold. A few prayed to the Emperor. A few prayed to anything that would listen. Most just stayed silent, hoping that if they were quiet enough, the monster would not notice them. And, strangely, it worked. Alucard passed within meters of hiding families, wounded children, elderly citizens too frail to run. He glanced at them, acknowledged their existence with a flicker of those glowing red eyes, and then moved on. Not out of mercy, not out of compassion, but because they were not part of the fight, and therefore not interesting. He was hunting, and prey that did not resist was not worth the effort. The battle raged for hours. More cultists poured from the rift. More guardsmen arrived, accompanied by chimera transports and heavy weapons teams. They set up firing lines, called in artillery, tried to collapse buildings on Alucard's position. He shrugged off rubble. He walked through flames. He regenerated from direct hits by autocannons, and stood there, waiting for them to run out of ammunition so he could continue the slaughter. By the time dawn broke, if dawn was even the right word for the sickly gray light that passed for morning on Tertius-Kani, the street was silent. Cultists lay dead or dying. Guardsmen had retreated to regroup, and Alucard stood in the center of it all, coat billowing in a wind that did not exist, surrounded by corpses that outnumbered the living 3-1. He looked up at the rift, still pulsing with warp energy, and felt something close to satisfaction. Not because he had won. Winning implied there had been stakes. But because, for the first time since arriving in this universe, he had been allowed to do what he did best. He had been allowed to be a monster. And the Imperium, watching from their fortified positions, did not see a savior. They saw something worse. They saw hope born from apathy. A creature that killed their enemies not because it cared about their survival, but because the violence itself was the reward. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that was the closest thing to salvation they were going to get. The Inquisition arrived 3 days later, as they always did, too late to prevent the crisis, perfectly timed to assign blame. They came in gunships painted black and red, bearing the seal of the Ordo Malleus, the demon hunters, because reports of the incident had been sufficiently apocalyptic to warrant their attention. Witnesses spoke of a creature that could not die, that slaughtered cultists and guardsmen alike, that walked through fire and lost fire and remained smiling. Some claimed he was a weapon of chaos. Others insisted he had fought chaos. A few suggested he was both, and those individuals were quietly removed from the witness pool for their own mental health. The inquisitor leading the investigation was named Castamir, and he was very good at his job. He had purged 12 worlds of corruption, executed 4 planetary governors for heresy, and once stared down a demon prince long enough for an Aversir assassin to finish the job. He did not frighten easily. But when he saw Alucard standing in the ruins of what had been a chapel, casually inspecting the skull of a dead cultist, Castamir felt something cold settle in his chest. Alucard looked up, smiled. "You must be management," he said, tossing the skull aside. Castamir did not respond immediately. Instead, he gestured to the psychers in his retinue, powerful sanctioned witches trained to probe minds and scour souls. They stepped forward, eyes glowing with psychic light, and reached out with their powers. They recoiled instantly, not because Alucard had attacked them, but because touching his mind was like touching a black hole. There was no surface, no thoughts to read, just a void filled with screaming souls, an abyss that stared back with thousands of eyes, all of them hungry. One psyker collapsed, bleeding from the nose. Another vomited. The third whispered a prayer and took a step back, shaking. "He is not human," one of them managed, voice trembling. "Obviously," Castamir replied, hand resting on the bolt pistol at his hip. Alucard watched this exchange with open amusement. "Psychic probes, how invasive. I didn't even get dinner first." Castamir ignored the mockery. "Identify yourself. Does it matter?" Alucard asked, tilting his head. "You've already decided what I am. You are a creature of the warp, a demon lord masquerading as a savior." Alucard laughed, not the wild, manic laughter he wore in battle, but something quieter, darker. "Demon lord, that's almost a compliment, but no, I'm not one of theirs." "Then what are you?" "A vampire," Alucard said simply. "An undead, a monster. Pick whichever label makes you feel like you understand me. You'll be wrong anyway." Castamir narrowed his eyes. Vampirism was not unheard of in the Imperium. There were Xenos species in chaos. Mutations that mimicked the condition, but this creature did not fit any known classification. He did not radiate warp energy. He was not possessed. And yet he was clearly not human. "You killed Imperial soldiers," Castamir said. "They shot me," Alucard replied. Seemed rude not to respond. "You slaughtered them." "Only a few, the rest ran. Smart of them. You mock the Imperium." "I mock everything," Alucard said, grin widening. It's one of my few pleasures. Castamir's retinue tent. Several aimed their weapons. The psychers prepared wards. But Castamir himself remained still, studying this creature that treated accusations of heresy like jokes. You fight chaos, Castamir said slowly, watching for a reaction.
Why?
Alucard shrugged. They attacked me. I attacked back. Simple as that. You do not serve the Emperor. Correct. You do not believe in the Imperium's mission. I don't believe in much of anything, Alucard admitted. Gods, empires, causes, they're all just excuses for the same thing: control. Someone tells you what to fight for, and you do it because the alternative is admitting life has no meaning. I skipped that step. Castamir felt anger flicker not at the words, but at the casual nihilism behind them. This creature had saved lives, killed heretics, and driven back a chaos incursion. And yet he claimed to care about none of it. Then why do you continue fighting? Castamir asked. Alucard's smile softened, just slightly. Because it's entertaining. There it was. The truth laid bare. Not duty, not faith, not even hatred. Entertainment. This creature treated war, the fundamental state of existence in the 41st millennium, as a game. Castamir made his decision. You are hereby declared excommunicate traitorous, he announced. A rogue entity of unknown origin and hostile intent. Termination is authorized. Alucard blinked. That was fast. You are a threat to the Imperium. I just saved one of your cities. You did not save it, Castamir said coldly. You entertained yourself while it happened to survive. That is not salvation. That is coincidence. Alucard considered this, then nodded. Fair. The retinue opened fire. Bolter rounds, melta-blasts, psychic lightning, all of it converged on Alucard in a storm of lethal force. His body was obliterated, reduced to chunks of meat and a spreading pool of blood. Castamir watched, waiting. The blood moved. It gathered, flowed, reformed. Within seconds, Alucard stood exactly where he had been, adjusting his hat and brushing imaginary dust from his coat. That tickled, he said. Castamir's jaw tightened. He turned to his retinue. Bring the blank. A figure stepped forward, shrouded in a hood. Blank soulless humans whose very existence created a void in the warp were rare and unnerving. Even standing near one felt wrong, like standing next to an absence shaped like a person. Alucard's smile faltered. Not in fear, but in discomfort. The blank's aura pressed against him, not suppressing his power, but making it itch. Like a wound that refused to heal properly. Interesting, Alucard murmured. He took a step toward the blank. The blank took a step back. Alucard grinned. You should run. The blank did. Castamir fired, covering the retreat. Alucard dodged lazily, then looked back at the Inquisitor with something approaching respect. You're braver than most, Alucard said. But you should know I'm not your enemy. Not really. Then what are you? Alucard's grin returned, sharp and cold. I'm the punchline to a joke your Emperor never got to finish. And then he was gone, dissolving into shadow, leaving Castamir standing in the ruins with more questions than answers, and the uncomfortable certainty that he had just made a very, very dangerous enemy.
Or ally.
He was not sure which was worse. Warbands began hunting him deliberately. Word spread through the warp like infection through a wound, whispers carried by demons. Rumors traded between chaos champions. Vox transmissions intercepted by heretics who still remembered how to pray. There was a creature loose in the Imperium, something that killed without worship, that devoured demons like a man eating insects. It mocked the gods. It defied categorization. And most insulting of all, it was having fun. Khorne's followers came first. A war band of bloodletters, led by a herald that had earned its rank through 1,000 genocides, manifested on a battlefield where Alucard had been amusing himself with a skirmish between Imperial forces and cultists. The demons did not bother with subtlety. They roared, charged, and swung axes forged from hatred and brass. Alucard met them head-on. The first bloodletter lost its head before it realized what had happened. The second lost 3 limbs in a single sweep of shadow claws. The third managed to swing its axe, cleaving through Alucard's torso right before Alucard regenerated and bit through the demon's throat, pulling out whatever passed for a demon's essence and swallowing it whole. The herald roared, fury incarnate, and struck with enough force to shatter tank armor. Alucard caught the blow, not with a weapon, with his hand. Bare fingers wrapped around the burning blade, flesh sizzling, bones cracking and then healing faster than the damage could spread. The herald stared, incomprehension flickering across its bestial face. This was impossible. Mortal flesh did not withstand blessed demon weapons. Mortal will did not laugh in the face of Khorne's wrath. But Alucard was not mortal. He twisted, yanked the axe from the herald's grip, and drove it through the demon's skull. The herald dissolved, screaming back into the warp. Alucard stood there, surrounded by dissolving demon corpses, and tilted his head. "That's it?" The warp answered. More demons poured through, not just bloodletters but demonettes now, slithering and giggling, sent by Slaanesh to test this creature with temptation instead of violence. They whispered promises, offered pleasures beyond imagination, draped themselves across his shoulders like living silk. Alucard looked at them with the same expression a man might reserve for particularly persistent flies. Then he killed them too. Not with anger, not with disgust. With boredom. He tore through their ranks mechanically, efficiently, storing their essences in the same void where he kept every soul he had ever consumed. The demonettes shrieked, not in pain but in offense, because being ignored was worse than being destroyed.
Slaanesh found this amusing.
Sinchi's champions tried next horrors and flamers, creatures of change and mutation, accompanied by a chaos sorcerer who believed he could bind Alucard with the right incantation, the right combination of true names and ritual geometry. He was half right. The ritual did affect Alucard.
It slowed him,
made his regeneration falter. For a moment, just a moment, he felt the weight of reality trying to reassert itself, trying to define him, categorize him, bind him to rules that his existence had violated for centuries.
Alucard stopped moving,
looked down at the glowing sigils wrapped around his limbs like chains. Then he flexed. The sigils shattered. Not dissolved, shattered, like glass struck by a hammer. The sorcerer's concentration broke, blood pouring from his eyes as the backlash hit. Alucard walked toward him, each step deliberate, shadows pooling around his feet. "Good attempt," Alucard said. "But I've been bound by better." He consumed the sorcerer, ritual and all, adding the man's knowledge of warpcraft to the centuries of experience already swimming in his mind. And that was when chaos stopped being curious and started being interested. Not afraid. Never afraid. But interested. Because Alucard was not just surviving their attention, he was adapting to it. Learning from it. Each encounter taught him something new about how this universe worked, how demons functioned, how the warp could be manipulated. He was not a psyker. He could not cast spells or bend reality with thought. But he could devour those who could and take their knowledge with him. Greater demons began to notice. A bloodthirster, one of Khorne's mightiest champions, descended onto a world Alucard had claimed as his temporary hunting ground. The beast was 30 feet of muscle and rage, wielding an axe that had cleaved titans in half. It did not speak. It did not negotiate. It simply attacked, because that was what Khorne's champions did. The battle lasted hours. Alucard fought with everything: guns, shadows, claws, fangs, and the raw essence of every soul he had consumed. He tore chunks from the bloodthirster's hide. The bloodthirster shattered his body a dozen times. Neither could permanently kill the other. They traded blows that leveled buildings, that turned the battlefield into a crater, that left the air tasting of copper and ash. And then Alucard did something unexpected. He stopped trying to kill it. Instead, he grabbed the bloodthirster mid-swing, pulled it close, and bit into its essence. Not its flesh, its essence. The fundamental demon stuff that defined it. He drank deep, pulling power directly from the creature's connection to Khorne, siphoning its strength like a vampire draining blood. The bloodthirster roared, not in pain but in confusion. This should not be possible. Demons were sustained by the warp, by the gods who created them.
Taking that sustenance away was like trying to drink an ocean. But Alucard was very, very thirsty.
The bloodthirster weakened,
Shrunk. Its form destabilized.
and then, for the first time in its existence, it felt something it had never felt before.
Vulnerability.
It fled, retreated back into the warp, howling in fury and humiliation. Alucard wiped his mouth, grinning,
Khorne watched from his brass throne and laughed.
not in mockery, in approval. Because this creature, this undying, irreverent monster had done something remarkable.
It had hurt one of his champions, made it retreat. And in Khorne's eyes, that was worthy of respect.
Slaanesh whispered into the warp, intrigued by a creature that rejected pleasure yet indulged in violence. Sinch calculated, schemes upon schemes, trying to find the thread that would unravel this anomaly. Nurgle waited, patient as rot, knowing that even the undying eventually decay. And Alucard, standing alone on a ruined battlefield, looked up at the roiling warp sky and smiled. Because for the first time since arriving in this nightmare universe, he understood the rules.
Chaos could not kill him, but he could hurt chaos, and that was all he needed.
The hunt had begun. The Space Marines came with the certainty of demigods and the patience of executioners. They were Black Templars, a crusading chapter that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of righteous violence. They did not negotiate,
Did not compromise.
They arrived on the world where Alucard had been sighted, declared it a zone of active heresy, and began the methodical process of purging anything that did not swear absolute loyalty to the God Emperor. Alucard happened to be in their way. The first squad found him in the ruins of a manufactorum, sitting on a pile of cultist corpses, cleaning blood from under his nails. The sergeant, a veteran of 2 centuries of warfare, raised his bolter without hesitation.
In the name of the Emperor, identify yourself.
Alucard looked up, mildly interested. You're well armed for priests. We are the Emperor's wrath. You will submit or be destroyed. Alucard stood, brushing dust from his coat. I don't do submission, bad history with it. The sergeant fired. The boltron struck Alucard in the chest, the mass-reactive warhead detonating inside his torso, blowing a crater through his ribs and spine. He staggered, blood spraying, organs visible through the wound. Then he laughed. The wound closed. Flesh knitted. Bone reformed. Within seconds, Alucard stood whole, grinning at the Marines with something that might have been respect. Your turn, he said.
And then he moved.
Not fast by his standards, he was testing them, curious about what these armored giants could do. But fast enough that the Marines had to actually try. He closed the distance before they could adjust their aim, shadows wrapping around one Marine's helmet and crushing it like aluminum foil. The sergeant swung a chainsword, the teeth screaming as they bit into Alucard's shoulder. Alucard grabbed the blade mid-swing, yanked it forward, and tore the Marine's arm off at the elbow.
Ceramite should not break like that.
Power armor was designed to withstand anti-tank fire. But Alucard was not anti-tank fire. He was something else, something that treated genetically enhanced super soldiers like an interesting obstacle instead of an insurmountable threat. The squad fought brilliantly. Coordinated. Disciplined.
Textbook Space Marine tactic.
They laid down suppressing fire, used frag grenades to create distance, called in support from their brothers. More squads arrived, then entire companies, because the Black Templars did not retreat and did not accept stalemate. Alucard fought them all. He tore through power armor with bare hands, dodged bolter fire with inhuman grace, regenerated from plasma shots that should have vaporized him. He was not stronger than a Space Marine pound for pound. They outmatched him.
But he was older, faster.
And most importantly, he could not be killed by conventional means. The chaplain leading the assault force watched the battle unfold and felt something he had not felt in decades.
Doubt. Not in the Emperor.
Never that. But doubt that conventional warfare would end this. The creature fought like a demon but had no warp signature. Moved like a Xenos, but bled like a human. Mocked like a heretic, but killed chaos wherever it found it. "What are you?" the chaplain demanded, voice amplified through his skull-faced helmet. Alucard paused mid-swing, a Marine's helmet crushed in his grip. "Does it matter? You are an abomination. Probably. You defile the Emperor's domain with your existence." Alucard dropped the helmet, thoughtful. "Your Emperor, he's the corpse on the golden throne, right? The one your entire species prays to?" The chaplain's fury was palpable, a heat that radiated even through ceramite. "You dare, I'm curious," Alucard interrupted. "Does he answer? When you pray, does he actually respond, or do you just assume the silence means he's listening?" The chaplain charged. It was not tactical. It was not strategic. It was rage given form, a demigod in ornate armor swinging a Crozius arcanum with enough force to shatter stone. Alucard met the charge, caught the weapon mid-swing, and for a moment, just a moment, the two stood locked, strength against strength. "I've met gods," Alucard said quietly, face inches from the chaplain's helmet. "Real ones, the kind that walk and talk and bleed, and you know what I learned?" He twisted, using the chaplain's momentum against him, and slammed the Marine into the ground hard enough to crack the pavement. "They're just as disappointing as everything else." The chaplain tried to rise. Alucard stepped on his chest, pinning him. "But you," Alucard continued, almost conversationally. "You're interesting. You fight for a corpse, die for a dream, and you do it with absolute conviction. That's almost admirable." He leaned closer. "Almost." Then he let the chaplain go, stepping back. The Marines regrouped, weapons trained. Alucard raised his hands, mockingly peaceful. "I'm bored now," he said. "You've made your point. You're strong, disciplined, fanatical. Congratulations. You will face judgment," the chaplain growled, rising to his feet. "Maybe," Alucard admitted. "But not today." He dissolved into shadows, vanishing before the Marines could fire, leaving them standing in the ruins with dozens of wounded brothers and the uncomfortable knowledge that they had just fought something they could not kill. The chaplain looked at the destruction, at the shattered armor and scorched ground, and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This creature was not a demon. Not a Xeno. Not even a heretic. It was something worse. It was a rival. An entity that stood outside the Imperium's rules, outside the Emperor's light, and simply did not care. It fought when it wanted, killed who it wanted, and then left, indifferent to conquest or conversion. And that, the chaplain realized, was more dangerous than any chaos warband. Because you could kill an enemy, you could convert a heretic, but you could not defeat something that refused to be defined by your terms. The Black Templars withdrew to regroup, to strategize, to report this incident to higher command. And somewhere in the shadows, Alucard smiled, because he had just fought angels, and they had not bored him. That was rare. Exterminatus was not a decision made lightly. It was the Imperium's final answer to corruption too deep to cleanse, heresy too widespread to contain, or Xeno's infestation too catastrophic to risk spreading. It was the erasure of entire worlds, the death of billions, sanctioned by inquisitorial decree and carried out with weapons that turned planets into tombs. The world was called Vespera the Ninth, and it had been condemned. Not because of Alucard, not officially, but because the taint of chaos had spread too far. The populace had fallen too deeply into worship of the ruinous powers. The fact that Alucard had been sighted there repeatedly, killing cultists and demons with reckless abandon, only complicated the calculus. The Inquisition's report was clear. The world was lost. Purge it from orbit. Alucard was in the capital hive when the first lance strikes hit. He was sitting in what had been a cathedral, now defaced with chaos iconography, watching cultists argue about which god deserved more sacrifices. It was almost funny, watching them bicker over theology while their world burned. He had been considering killing them more out of boredom than duty when the sky lit up. Brilliant white beams lanced down from orbit, each one carrying enough energy to vaporize city blocks. The cultists stopped arguing.
started screaming, ran in every direction as if running would matter. Alucard looked up through the shattered roof and saw the inquisitorial fleet hanging in orbit like vultures. "Exterminatus," he murmured. "How dramatic." The ground shook. Buildings collapsed. The atmosphere ignited. This was not warfare, this was cremation on a planetary scale. Billions would die in the next hour. Billions more would die in the days that followed, as the world's ecosystem collapsed and the air became unbreathable. Alucard stood, walked to the edge of the ruined cathedral, and looked out over the dying city. He could leave. Shadow step into the warp, reappear on another world. He had done it before. Staying was pointless. And yet, he noticed movement below. Civilians, thousands of them fleeing toward what they thought were safe zones. They were wrong, of course. There were no safe zones. The Inquisition had committed to total annihilation. But they did not know that. They ran, carrying children, dragging elderly, clinging to hope that someone, somewhere, still cared. Alucard watched them. And against every instinct, against the core of what he was, he felt something stir. Not compassion. He had discarded that centuries ago. Not duty, he owed these people nothing. But something else. Something petty and defiant. The Inquisition thought it could erase everything here, including him, and call it righteousness. He found that insulting. So he moved. Not to save them, he was not a hero. But to annoy the Inquisition. To prove that their grand, catastrophic gesture could be undermined by a single, stubborn monster who refused to play by their rules. He spread his shadows across the fleeing masses, a canopy of darkness that absorbed the lance strikes meant for them. Energy that should have atomized thousands was instead devoured by the void he carried within himself. It hurt the raw Imperial firepower testing even his regeneration buddy held. The civilians looked up, saw the shadow protecting them, and did not understand. Some thought it was the Emperor's mercy. Some thought it was a demon's trap. Most just kept running, because understanding was a luxury they could not afford. Alucard did not bother explaining. He stood there, arms spread, taking orbital bombardment like rainfall, letting the pain wash over him because pain was familiar and fury was honest. The Inquisition noticed. Inquisitor Castamir, watching from the flagship's bridge, saw the anomaly on the tactical display zone where lance strikes were being absorbed, where millions should be dead but were instead fleeing. He recognized the signature immediately. "The vampire," he said, voice tight. "Should we intensify fire?" an officer asked. Castamir stared at the screen, jaw clenched. This creature, this abomination, was shielding heretics, protecting those marked for death. And yet, it had also killed more chaos cultists in the past month than an entire regiment of guardsmen. "No," Castamir said finally. "Let him have his gesture. It changes." He was right. Even Alucard's defiance could not save a world. He shielded thousands, but billions still died. The atmosphere burned. The oceans boiled. The planet's crust cracked under the sustained bombardment, revealing magma that would consume what little remained. Vespera the 9th would be a dead rock by morning, a cautionary tale in Imperial records. And Alucard, standing in the ruins, finally let the shadows drop. The survivors, those he had shielded, stared at him. Some wept, some prayed. One man, braver or more foolish than the rest, approached. "Why?" the man asked, voice hoarse. Alucard looked at him, expression unreadable. "Why what? Why save us? You're a monster. Everyone says so." Alucard considered this. "I am," he agreed. "But I'm also bored, and watching your Inquisition declare victory while I stand here, alive and unbothered, is more entertaining than letting them have their way." The man blinked, struggling to process this. "You saved us out of spite?" The man laughed, not joy hysteria. The laughter of someone whose world had just died and who no longer had the capacity for appropriate emotional responses. "We're alive because you were bored." "Correct." The man kept laughing until it became sobbing, and then he just collapsed. Alucard watched him fall, then looked around at the other survivors. They were exhausted, traumatized,
Doomed. Really, they had nowhere to go, no resources, and within days they would die of exposure or starvation.
He had not saved them.
He had delayed their deaths. And for the first time since arriving in this universe, Alucard felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest.
Not guilt, never that. But something adjacent.
A recognition that in a universe built on scales this vast, on cruelty this systematic, even his power was insignificant. He could kill millions. Withstand orbital bombardment.
Mock gods.
But he could not stop the machinery of the Imperium once it decided to turn. He looked up at the inquisitorial fleet, still hovering, still firing.
And he was not amused anymore. Just bored.
Deeply, profoundly bored. Because even mass extinction, even the death of worlds, had become routine. He dissolved into shadow, leaving the survivors to their fate, and vanished into the warp. The Inquisition declared Vespera the Ninth cleansed.
They were not wrong.
But they had not won either. Because somewhere in the galaxy, Alucard was still walking.
Still hunting. Still refusing to die.
And that was the one thing they could not cleanse.
Alucard had always known gods existed.
He had served one, once or something close enough to it. The vampire king Dracula had wielded power that bordered on divine, had defied death itself until death came wearing a Belmont's face. Alucard had inherited that defiance, that refusal to accept limitations. But gods in his experience were distant things.
Abstract.
Powers that demanded worship but rarely intervened. The chaos gods were not distant. They were immediate.
Present.
Real in a way that made Earth's deities look like shadows on a cave wall. They existed in the warp, sustained by emotion and belief, fed by the suffering and joy of countless trillions. They were not metaphors. They were forces of nature given consciousness and malice.
And Alucard decided to hunt them, not out of righteousness,
not to save the Imperium or protect humanity, but because he was bored, and gods had always been the most interesting targets. He started small demon princes, former mortals elevated to demonhood, powerful but still bound by their patron's whims. He found them in warp rifts, in corrupted space hulks, in the ruins of worlds where reality wore thin. He killed them, studied them, consumed their essence to understand how they worked. Then he went deeper. The warp was not a place in the traditional sense. It was a dimension of thought and nightmare, where physics bent to emotion and geography was a polite suggestion. Navigating it required either psychic ability or suicidal recklessness.
Alucard had neither and both.
He could not shape the warp with his mind, but he could tear through it with brute force, his shadows carving paths through the impossible. He walked through territories claimed by Khorne, where rivers of blood flowed uphill and mountains of skulls scraped skies that screamed. Bloodletters descended in legions, and he tore through them, learning their patterns, adapting to their fury. He reached one of Khorne's fortresses, a brass citadel, where champions trained for eternity, and walked through the gates uninvited.
The champions attacked. He killed them. They reformed.
He killed them again. It was not a battle. It was a statement. He found a throne room, empty save for trophies of 1 billion wars, and sat in the champion's seat.
And waited.
Khorne's presence descended not the god himself, but a fragment, an avatar of rage given temporary focus. It manifested as a towering figure of brass and fire, a manifestation of pure wrath. "You dare!"
Alucard grinned.
"I dare. You are not worthy. Probably not, but I'm here anyway." The avatar roared, and reality buckled. The fortress trembled. The warp itself recoiled from the force of Khorne's fury. Alucard felt the weight of it, the sheer cosmic pressure of a god's attention, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt small.
Then he stood.
"You're a god of war," Alucard said. "I'm a creature who's been fighting since before your youngest cultist was born. Let's see which matters more, divinity or experience." They fought. It was not a battle mortals could have witnessed and remained sane. Alucard's shadows clashed against divine fire. His claws tore through avatars that reformed faster than he could destroy them. The Avatar's weapons axes forged from the concept of murder cleaved through him repeatedly, each blow carrying the weight of 1,000,000,000 deaths. He regenerated, adapted,
learned.
He could not kill the Avatar. It was sustained by Khorne's will, and Khorne's will was eternal. But he could hurt it. He could make it falter.
And that was enough.
Eventually, the Avatar withdrew, not defeated but frustrated, as if Khorne himself had decided this entertainment had run its course. Alucard stood in the ruins of the throne room, breathing heavily not from exhaustion but from exhilaration. "I'll be back," he said to the empty space. He turned his attention to Slaanesh next. The Palace of Pleasure was labyrinthine, a place where corridors were built from living flesh and doors opened onto impossible vistas of ecstasy and agony.
Demonettes whispered promises.
Perfumes that could drive mortals to madness filled the air.
Slaanesh's realm was seduction as architect.
Alucard walked through it unimpressed. He had tasted every excess centuries ago. Pleasure had been his for the taking when he was human, then again when he became a vampire. He had indulged until indulgence became monotony. Slaanesh offered nothing he had not already discarded. The demons realized this and shifted tactics. Instead of seduction, they tried pain.
Torture that transcended flesh.
Psychological torment that would break even the most disciplined minds. Alucard laughed through all of it. Because pain, like pleasure, was familiar. He had been tortured. Had tortured others.
Had lived through agony that would shatter souls.
Slaanesh's realm was just another variation on a theme he had mastered. He found the center a throne where Slaanesh's greatest champions lounged, beings of impossible beauty and perfect horror. They looked at him with curiosity and contempt. "You are empty," one of them said, voice like silk over razors.
"Correct," Alucard agreed. "Then why come here?"
He smiled.
"To prove that emptiness beats decadence."
He killed them.
Not for sport, not for satisfaction, but to make a point.
Saintche's domain was next the impossible fortress, a structure that existed in 9 dimensions simultaneously, where every corridor was a trap and every door a riddle. Sorcerers who had spent centuries navigating its halls went mad trying to map it. Alucard did not bother with navigation. He tore through walls, ignored puzzles, broke the architecture itself, forcing direct paths through a place designed to confuse. Saintche's demons, horrors, and flamers tried to stop him with magic and mutation. He consumed them, adding their knowledge to his own, learning the patterns of warpcraft through devouring those who practiced it. He never found Saintche's core. The architect of fate was too clever for that, too layered in contingencies and paradoxes.
But he left scars.
Breaches in the impossible fortress that would take millennia to repair.
Nurgle's garden was last.
It was a place of rot and rebirth, where plagues bloomed like flowers and despair was cultivated like crops. Everything here was dying and everything here was eternal. Nurgle's philosophy made manifest that decay was inevitable and acceptance was freedom. Alucard hated it immediately, not because it was grotesque. He had seen worse, but because it was passive. Nurgle's followers accepted their rot, embraced it, called it love. There was no defiance here.
No rage.
Just resignation dressed up as enlightenment. He burned it.
Not with fire. Fire was too clean.
He used his shadows, the void he carried, the absence that consumed demons and plagues alike. He carved a wound through the garden, a sterile scar where nothing could grow. Nurgle noticed. Laughed, a sound like bubbling tar.
Because even destruction was transformation.
Even sterility would eventually rot. But Alucard had made his point. The Chaos Gods could not kill him. But he could hurt them. He could walk into their domains, challenge their champions, defy their nature, and walk out again. Not victorious. Never that. But undefeated. And in the warp, where gods shaped reality, that was the closest thing to winning.
Time passed. Or perhaps it did not.
In the warp, duration was subjective. In the Imperium, it was measured in wars and crusades, and the slow, grinding entropy of civilization.
Alucard did not keep track.
He simply existed, wandering from war zone to war zone, from warp rift to warp rift, hunting because hunting was all he knew. The Imperium no longer tried to classify him. Some inquisitors declared him a rogue asset. Others called him a demon of unknown origin. A few, in private, admitted he might be useful if only he could be controlled. But control was not something Alucard permitted. He appeared where he wanted, killed what amused him, and vanished before anyone could contain him. Legends grew. Guardsmen whispered about a red-coated figure who walked through artillery fire and laughed. Cultists told stories of a vampire who devoured demons and mocked the gods themselves. Space Marines recorded him in after-action reports as unknown hostile entity status, unresolved. The Chaos God stopped actively hunting him, not because he had won, but because the effort was no longer entertaining. Khorne had grown bored of an opponent who could not permanently die. Slaanesh found him too empty to corrupt. Tzeentch calculated that the energy spent manipulating him outweighed the potential returns. Nurgle simply waited, patient as always, knowing that even the undying eventually grow tired. But Alucard did not grow tired. Or perhaps he did, and that was the point. He refused thrones. When warlords offered him command, he killed them. When cultists tried to worship him, he slaughtered them. When imperial officials attempted negotiation, he ignored them. He had no interest in empires or armies or causes. Those were distractions, structures built by mortals to convince themselves their brief lives mattered. Alucard knew better. Life did not matter. Death did not matter. Meaning was a lie mortals told themselves to cope with the vastness of their insignificance. And yet, paradoxically, that insignificance was what made existence bearable. Because if nothing mattered, then everything was permitted. He wandered the galaxy, a ghost in red, hunting the only things that still challenged him: greater demons, chaos champions, and occasionally, the Space Marines who insisted on trying to kill him. On a world called Mordax Tertius, he fought alongside an Imperial regiment against a Nurgle warband, not because he cared about the Imperium's victory, but because the Plague Marines annoyed him. On the edge of the maelstrom, he dueled a demon prince for 3 days straight, neither able to kill the other, until both grew bored and left. On a nameless hive world, he sat on a rooftop and watched an exterminatus fleet reduce the planet to slag, indifferent to the billions dying below. He had saved some. He had killed more. The ratio did not trouble him. Occasionally he thought about his original world. About the Hellsing organization. About Integra, who had commanded him with a certainty he respected even as he mocked it. He wondered if they had noticed his absence. If they cared. Probably not. His purpose there had been fulfilled. He had been a weapon, and weapons were replaced when they broke or disappeared. This universe had no such convenience. Here, he was not a weapon. He was an anomaly. A glitch in a system that ran on faith and fury, and the slow, inevitable collapse of everything humanity had built. He existed outside its rules, and that made him more dangerous than any demon or Xenos. Because the Imperium could fight enemies, could burn heretics, could wage war for 10,000 years without pause. But it could not erase him. And that was the joke. The Imperium claimed to be humanity's shield, its last bulwark against extinction. But it was also humanity's prison, a system so vast and cruel that even salvation looked like damnation. Alucard did not serve it, did not oppose it. He simply walked through it, indifferent, killing what he wanted, and ignoring what he did not. He was the monster the Imperium feared it would become if it ever stopped believing its own lies. And he smiled, because that thought amused him. Somewhere in the warp, chaos whispered his name not with fear, but with irritation. He was the predator who could not be hunted, the prey that refused to die, the joke that gods told each other when they wanted to feel humbled. Somewhere in the Imperium, Inquisitors updated his file. Still active, still uncontained, still unclassified. And Alucard, standing on the edge of a dying world, watching the stars burn and the warp scream, felt something close to contentment. Not happiness. Never that. But contentment. Because finally, after centuries of monotony, he had found a universe that could keep him entertained.
Not forever.
Nothing lasted forever, not even eternity. But for now, the hunt continued.
And that was enough.